Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 872 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are excited to reshare our conversation with our guest, Dr. Martha Muñoz. Listeners, Martha is an evolutionary biologist who studies how and why evolution proceeds unevenly across the tree of life. Some features and branches of organisms evolve really quickly, while others remain inert or nearly inert for millions of years. Her research is uncovering the mechanisms underlying this phenomenon, and she's discovered that behavior is a key architect of evolution. And in our conversation, Martha shares more about her life, her career, and her research. So listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Martha Muñoz. So, Martha, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you joining us, and we're looking forward to learning more about you and your work today. But let me first start by telling our listeners a little bit about you, your current position, and how you got there. So listeners, Martha is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. She received her bachelor's degree in biology from Boston University. And afterwards, Martha worked as a Fulbright Research Scholar at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid, Spain. She was awarded her Ph.D. in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology from Harvard University. Next, Martha conducted postdoctoral research in the Research School of Biology at the Australian National University, and subsequently the Department of Biology at Duke University. Prior to accepting her current position at Yale, Martha served on the faculty in the Department of Biological Sciences at Virginia Tech. Now, Martha has received numerous awards and honors, including the Boston University Department of Biology's Distinguished Alumni Rising Star Award and a Young Investigator Award from the American Society of Naturalists. She was also named a Scientist to Watch by the Scientist magazine in 2019. And today, Martha joins us to talk about her life and her science. So Martha, we want to get to know you as a scientist, but also in general as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I think that my love of science actually spills out into the things that I do outside of science. I spend a lot of time outdoors. I really love to hike, especially if there's a possibility for an amazing view or the opportunity to see an organism I haven't seen yet. So I do like to spend a lot of time in nature and just soaking it all in. I find it a source of peace, but also a source of inspiration for what I do in the lab as well. When I'm not outdoors, I like to read. I'm an avid reader. I'm usually reading a few books at a time. I really love museums. In fact, my love of science really started in a major way through the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And my whole family's still in New York City, so I go as often as I can to visit them. I have a little niece, and one of my favorite things to do is just spend time with her and discover the joys of watching her grow up.
Oh, that is phenomenal. It sounds like you've got a lot to occupy your time outside of science. And you mentioned you're an avid reader. I am as well. So we love to give book recommendations to everybody out there who's listening. So Martha, do you have a favorite book or maybe one you're reading right now that you can recommend?
Well, right now I'm reading The Trial by Kafka. I really love fiction. It's a very interesting book, but the one I would definitely recommend to all readers is 100 Years of Solitude. It's my favorite book.
Most excellent. What did you like about it?
Everything. Even without discussing the plot, it's a celebration of language and it's a celebration of words. But the book itself, there's so much magic in what we would call mundane, that our reality, our world is imbued with endless inspiration and beauty if we take the time to look for it. I also appreciated the sense of love and community being the antidote to egotism. And the book itself, to me, feels rapturous. glutted with imagery and detail. There's nothing more heartbreakingly beautiful than the common mundane lives that we're so lucky to lead. I think the book really gets that across.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Well, Martha, we will put these on our website for our listeners to find there, The Trial and 100 Years of Solitude. And we chatted about life outside of science, but I do want to chat about your science as well. So how do you describe the work that you do to people who aren't familiar with science or your specific research?
I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study how evolution works. And I think that there's a general sense that the story is sort of open and closed, that back in 1859, with the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, that we sort of solved all the mysteries of evolution that there were to know. But in fact, we only just got started, and there's so much that we don't know yet about how evolution works. We're still really stitching together the story of what causes evolution to occur, what causes it to go quickly or go slowly. And my research in general is motivated by a really broad observation in nature, which is that evolution proceeds unevenly across the tree of life. Some features and some lineages get to be in evolutionary overdrive, evolving at warp speed, whereas others can remain inert or nearly so for millions of years. Think, for example, of what it must be like to drive on the Autobahn versus driving in New York City at rush hour. Evolution actually precedes something like this. Sometimes it's really fast and sometimes it's super slow. Why is that? Why do some traits get to be in overdrive where others are stuck in the slow lane? So my research centers on discovering the mechanism for this phenomenon. And one of the things I've discovered is that behavior is one of the key architects of evolution. And by behavior, I refer to all of the things that organisms can do simply by altering when they're active, where they're inactive, how they're active or inactive. Organisms have the power to expose themselves to greater natural selection, which in turn accelerates evolution. Or conversely, organisms have the power to shield themselves from selection and effectively pump the brakes on evolution. And there's a bigger message here, I think, which is that organisms, and we are organisms, are not passive vessels at the whim and mercy of the environment. Organisms have the agency to sculpt their own evolutionary trajectories.
Oh, I love it. Well, Martha, I cannot wait to get into some of the details of your work as we go through our conversation today. But I'd love to talk a little bit about motivation first. I'm a quote person, I'll admit. So I love collecting quotes, sayings, little bits of motivation from everybody I talk to. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or just something that really motivates you?
I'm like you as well. I love inspirational quotes and picking up tidbits of knowledge. One of my favorite books is Don Quixote de la Mancha. There's so many quotes in there. You could pick the whole book apart. But there's one which is very tongue-in-cheek, but it has a broader meaning for me. So the quote in Spanish is, El que lee mucho y anda mucho, ve mucho y sabe mucho, which translated literally means, he who walks a lot and reads a lot, sees a lot and knows a lot.
I like it.
Which has many meanings, but to me means that our world expands simply by experiencing it, and that there's no limit to what we can learn or see simply by going out there and learning and seeing.
That is phenomenal. I see how the hiking then ties into your science because you're getting out there in the world, exploring and continuing to kind of think about your work as you're out there, right?
Oh, that's very true. Yes.
Phenomenal. Well, thank you for sharing this piece of motivation with me and our listeners today. And I'd love to talk next, Martha, about some of the people who might have had a big impact or might have motivated you at different points in your life. So when you think back, are there role models or mentors or just inspirational figures that you looked up to?
I've had so many wonderful role models in my career, including folks who have been directly mentors to me and other folks whose work and lives I've looked up to. So starting in evolutionary biology, I, of course, was deeply inspired by Charles Darwin's journey. And I spent a lot of time researching Charles Darwin, learning everything I could about him. I even did a trip to London and wrote a travel log of my journeys through London in search of all things Darwin.
Oh, wow. Wow.
But the more I got to know Darwin, the more I actually started to learn about one of his contemporaries, Thomas Henry Huxley. And I started to find a little bit more that I could relate to in Huxley. He came from a lower socioeconomic background. He really had to fight his way up. He had to work his way through school and take odd jobs here and there. And his pathway to science wasn't always the easiest, but he was persistent, very tenacious, very hardworking, and I found lots of inspiration from Thomas Huxley's story. But in terms of contemporaries, I've been very deeply inspired by Rosemary and Peter Grant, who are two evolutionary biologists based out of Princeton. And their work in the Galapagos Islands over the course of several decades has been a really big inspiration to me as a scientist on several fronts. First, they really demonstrated how much could be learned simply by observing organisms with patience and time over a long period. They studied the same birds. I mean, they knew the birds individually. That's how closely they monitored these organisms. They lived in the Galapagos for months at a time. And when they emerged, they had detailed records and data that allowed them to address really big questions in evolutionary biology. How does it all work? Can we observe natural selection and evolution in the wild? And their stories have become classics and their findings, but I also draw from how they approach it and the value that they put on natural history and about pursuing basic fundamental curiosity, which is what science is. It's a curiosity-driven discipline. I actually got the chance to meet Rosemary and Peter Grant a few years ago when I was a postdoc at Duke, it turns out.
So what was it like then meeting these people that you had looked up to?
Oh, it was an out-of-body experience. So in addition to being extremely well-recognized and respected scientists, they're also very well known as exceptionally kind people and very generous with their time and advice. They were coming to Duke to give a talk, and when scientists do that, they often are given several slots with which to meet with faculty members and students. And I was vying for this opportunity to finally meet them one-on-one. So I had them in this room, in this conference room for 30 minutes. And they just asked me about my research, and off I went 20 minutes or so gushing about all the things I was working on and all my questions and what I hope to discover. And it was mostly me just spilling my guts about all my work. And they were asking really, really good questions. So it was a really excellent conversation. And oh God, I'm getting emotional remembering this. So towards the end of the meeting, I realized I might have had maybe 5 minutes left with them. And it suddenly struck me that our time together was going to come to a close. And I got very emotional and started telling them how much they'd inspired me to be a scientist and how much I looked up to them and what it meant to me to finally meet them one-on-one. And I started crying a little bit. And they're very British. And you could see they were like, oh dear. So I stopped crying just long enough to get a photograph with them, which I still have and treasure very much. Mm-hmm. And that was the time I got to meet Rosemary and Peter Grant.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I love it. Well, Martha, it sounds like you've had some really great people inspire you along your journey, but I want to know where this curiosity started for you. So do you have a memory of when you first started getting interested in science or the natural world?
I do, but it wasn't with the natural world itself because I lived mostly by proxies as a child. I grew up in New York City, in Queens, in Flushing, Queens, technically, in a very small apartment in a very urban area with very little access to green spaces. And my parents were born and raised in Cuba and came to the United States to seek a better life. So I grew up first generation American to Cuban parents in a very densely populated city with very little access to green spaces. And they were extremely supportive of my fascination with nature, but it wasn't immediately evident how they would be able to foment it. So what we ended up doing, this is thanks to my parents, was going to the American Museum of Natural History as often as was reasonably or unreasonably possible. And it wasn't just my parents. I have a lot of adults to thank because anytime I met an adult, I would ask them immediately to take me either to the Bronx Zoo, the Queens Botanical Garden, or most often to the American Museum of Natural History.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it was there. It was honestly there that wonder reflex for nature was stimulated for the first time, and continually every time I visited after that. Just wandering through the halls allowed me to soak up all of the diversity that exists today. And because of their halls of fossils, also the diversity that existed in the past. So in one big space, one city block, I was able to soak it all in, but none of it was technically alive. So there was this piece of me that longed to see nature in its place, to go outside and visit the rainforests of the world and the coral reefs of the world, and to see it all firsthand. But it never crossed my mind, to be honest, that I could be a scientist or what it actually meant to be a scientist. This wasn't a career that was accessible to me. It wasn't fathomable to be a scientist. And in fact, I thought, and I knew that I was going to pursue something scientific, but I thought that the way that I could do this was becoming a wildlife veterinarian, because I knew those existed from watching nature documentaries. And I knew that when all of these expeditions went out to the savannas and to the rainforest to study organisms, that there was always a wildlife veterinarian with them. And so I thought that that would be my way to get out into nature and to find a way to discover it all. And it actually wasn't until college, my first week of college, that I even discovered what practicing scientists were like, what academia really meant, and that I could pursue a career as a scientist.
Interesting. So then what were some of the steps that took you from this budding scientist, just realizing that this was an opportunity that you could pursue, to where you are today?
It was interesting because the transformation was almost instantaneous. Imagine going 18 years of your life not knowing that your dream job existed, or thinking that you were going to go on a different career path, and then within a few days discovering that this was a possibility and then instantly changing your entire trajectory for it. That's what happened to me. So two really important things happened when I started college, and I did my undergraduate at Boston University. And the story I'm about to tell took place basically the first week of freshman year when I was in undergrad. So I went in as a pre-veterinary student, and there I was, first day of Bio 101, sitting in somewhere near the front, and Dr. Chris Schneider was giving a lecture on the Cambrian explosion, which is a period in evolutionary history that occurred about 540 million years ago, in which the groups of organisms that we recognize today, arthropods and chordates and mollusks, basically appear very rapidly in the fossil record. But the representatives of those lineages are very different from the ones that we know today. They're almost alien-esque. If you look at Opabinia or Hallucigenia, I mean, just look at the name, Hallucigenia. This is an organism that was so strange and bizarre that it was reconstructed upside down for a long time before someone had the prescience to flip it back over.
Oh, wow.
That's how odd these organisms are. So I basically learned how deep in time our history, the history of life, and in this case, multicellular life belonging to groups of organisms that we recognize today, appeared in the fossil record. And I remember being so overwhelmed by how much my world had suddenly expanded in a span of a few minutes that it was like being hit with an experience freight train. This is becoming a recurring theme of the interview, by the way, but I was so moved, I actually started crying.
Oh, wow.
And I knew right there and then that I knew I wanted to become an evolutionary biologist, first and foremost, and that I must immediately figure out where and how to do that, because I wanted to ask the questions and figure out the things that evolutionary biologists were working on. It was immediate. And Chris did such a wonderful job just transporting you to the Burgess Shale and walking you through the fossils and the wonderment and awe of it all, which still stays with me. Stephen Jay Gould wrote an entire book about this fossil deposit, about the Cambrian explosion fauna, and not just what it means for the study of evolution. The implications are massive, but also just the wonderment of it all. He calls the fossils from the Cambrian explosion the great old ones, which is a Lovecraftian reference. So in addition to this transformative experience that I had in the classroom, I started working in a lab as a work study student, and I worked with Dr. Ayako Yamaguchi. Now, at the time, I had picked a specialization in biology in neuroscience, so I wanted to work with Dr. Yamaguchi because she was working on developmental neurobiology, and I was fascinated by what she was doing. And also, I was working my way in part through school, so I really just also needed the money. So I thought it would be really fun to get some experience and work in a lab. And little did I know that this would also really fundamentally change the course of my life. So Dr. Yamaguchi was relatively junior when I started working with her. She was an assistant professor. She had not so long ago been a graduate student, and not too long before that been an undergraduate. And suddenly I was working with a young woman who was doing scientific research. And I finally got to see firsthand what it is that scientists do, what it means to run a lab, what it means to run some experiments. And suddenly, basically overnight, I was doing that. I was, doing dissections and extracting laryngeal nerves and attaching them to force transducers and running actual scientific experiments. And I remember this one moment in the lab in which I had run an experiment measuring the tensile properties of the laryngeal muscle and seeing the data essentially flutter across the computer screen and realizing, oh my gosh, I collected those data. I did this. And she was leaning over my shoulder and walking me through this. And it suddenly hit me. Wait, I could be a scientist. I could do this. And that was it. I changed my career course immediately. I dropped the pre-veterinary track, which, by the way, I think I would have also been extremely happy as a wildlife veterinarian. But I knew that this was the thing. And I really did not look back since then. I've learned along the way how to achieve this dream because there is no obvious roadmap. And a lot of it is still word of mouth and dependent on the engagement of the mentors one has. But I just knew then and there that this is what I was going to do.
Definitely. And you had a really cool experience after undergrad to work at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid. So how did that opportunity come about?
That was interesting. I knew that I didn't want to go directly to graduate school. I wanted to gain some more experience doing research. And I also really wanted to live abroad. And so I inquired with my undergraduate advisor, who at this point was Chris Schneider, the professor from that first day of undergrad. And I told him what I had in mind and what I was hoping to do. And he recommended a colleague of his at the Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid. And he thought that our research interests would overlap, and they did. And so I filled out a Fulbright application detailing my ideas and what I hope to do and discover. And I was lucky enough for it to get funded. So I spent a little over a year doing research at the museum. And this was another experience which turned out to be very transformative because, of course, I had spent my childhood in museums, but from the public side of the gallery. Now, through this experience at the museum in Madrid, I got to experience it from the research side of the museum and deep into the collections and among the drawers cataloging life's biodiversity. And everything that I thought excited me about being on the public side was nothing compared to the feelings that I experienced being among the specimens themselves and opening drawers and letting nature surprise me in that way too.
Definitely. I think people maybe don't quite realize how much is actually sort of behind the scenes at a museum. It's only the tip of the iceberg what the public gets to see.
It's so true. For example, here at the Yale Peabody, we have millions of specimens from all types of collections. It's a treasure trove. I think it's the crown jewel of what we have to offer. There's limitless possibilities that collections provide. They document the past, the present, and they can inform the future. They're so important for the vitality of science.
Definitely. So then can you walk us through the decision you made then to go back to graduate school and then how that took you to your faculty position?
So while I was doing my research in Madrid, I was also applying for Ph.D. programs. And here's where dreams met a little bit of luck, because now that I look back, I honestly had no idea what I was doing. It could have honestly gone pear-shaped because I didn't really know how to look for mentors. I relied a lot on word of mouth, and I hadn't really deeply explored my interest in evolution enough to know fully where I wanted to go. And honestly, that's where grad school took me. Fortunately, Chris was able to really peer beneath the surface, explore my interests, and push me in the right direction, and gave me a lot of really good feedback on the sorts of advisors I might want to work with. And one of those folks was Jonathan Losses, who was then at Harvard. He's since moved back to Washington University in St. Louis, but he was at Harvard at the time. And that's where I worked with him. So Chris was actually the person who put me in contact with Jonathan. And Jonathan put a lot of faith in me when he took me on to his lab. I graduated a semester early from Boston University because I wanted to save money, honestly, was the reason. And I had the credits. And he had just moved to Harvard. So with all of the chaos of me leaving Boston and him just moving in, the only FaceTime we got before I actually was accepted to his lab was this very brief 20-minute meeting that we had in his temporary office, in which I can't even remember what I said, but I doubt it was extraordinarily intellectual. We barely got to know each other, and we just got some first impressions. And my first impression of him was that he was really friendly, really smart, and seemed like a really fun person to work with. And I was left with a really positive impression and applied to his lab from abroad in Spain, did a few more Skype chats, and that was that. I was accepted into his lab.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Well, it's been great to hear about some of these early stages of your career, Martha, but I do want to make sure we get to talk about the present and some of the amazing work that you are doing in the lab now. So do you have a favorite project that you are working on right now, Martha, that you want to tell me and our listeners about?
I have a lot of things that I'm working on right now, but I'm going to share one of the projects that's got me most excited. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that unevenness across the tree of life is the rule and not the exception, where some lineages and traits get to be in evolutionary overdrive, whereas others not so much. They might be much more inert over long periods of time. One of those phenomena of rapid evolution is known as adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation refers to the explosive diversification of some lineages. We can point, for example, to Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. That's a classic adaptive radiation. Anolis lizards in the Caribbean, which I have spent a lot of time working on since starting to work with Jonathan. And they're very fascinating because you have these systems in which a lot of speciation and ecological differentiation has occurred, oftentimes, but not exclusively, but oftentimes in a relatively short period of time. And in addition to all of these bursts of diversification, when we peer a little bit under the hood in these radiations, we discover that they often follow a predictable order. So by this, I mean that some aspect, be it coloration or morphology or physiology, those characters tend to saturate or diversify earlier in the radiation, and they're followed by a secondary, or in some cases, a tertiary pulse of diversification in some other aspect of the organism. So I've been intrigued by this. Why do adaptive radiations follow a predictable order? Why isn't it different order? Why A to B to C and not B to A to C? So the challenge with this is sort of reconstructing things that happened in the past. And this is a challenge that is pretty common for most evolutionary biologists. We are, in some ways, historians reconstructing events that have occurred oftentimes in the really deep past. So we're not really able to replay the tape of life, as Stephen Jay Gould would put it, and rerun all of these adaptive radiations from start to finish. In fact, even though they occur quickly over evolutionary time, that often involves millions of years. So we're sort of confronted with trying to reconstruct processes that occurred in the past and interpret why things occur the way that they do. But a lot of these constraints are liberated when we work with microbes. And one of the reasons for this is that microbes, well, there are many reasons, but microbes evolve much more quickly. because their generation times are shorter, their mutation rates are often faster. So several reasons why. So we can observe long patterns of evolution in terms of generations over very little human time by comparison. And another thing that makes microbes really exciting is that a lot more is known about the relationship between their genotypes, that is their underlying genetic structure, their genetic architecture, and the phenotypes that they contribute to. What is the connection between the genetic information encoded in these organisms and the characteristics that they express? So microbes are empowered in a way that vertebrate systems just simply are not. So one of the things I'm working on now is a really exciting collaboration with a microbial evolutionary biologist here at Yale, Álvaro Sánchez, who is also a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution, and Dr. Maria Rebolleda Gomez, who is a postdoctoral fellow. And we are working together to sort of answer this question: how and why are adaptive radiations predictable? What makes them predictable? Why do certain aspects saturate before others? Is it that certain phenotypes are genetically distant and hard to acquire? What's the role of mutation order in driving this? What's the role of epistasis in driving these patterns? What excites me about it is that it's sort of a pivot away from the way in which I've approached a lot of what I do. A lot of what I do is that historical reconstruction, but by collaborating with Álvaro and Maria, we're able to actually get in there under the hood and ask why and how and reconstruct processes using microbial systems.
Oh, that is so cool. Well, Martha, thank you so much for sharing one of these exciting projects that you are working on today. And you hinted at some of the challenges that you face as an evolutionary biologist. And I think regardless of what field of science you choose, there will be challenges, struggles, and difficult days. And we love to share those with our listeners so that they don't feel so alone when they experience them themselves. So do you have a favorite story of a struggle or a failure or a challenge that you faced that you can walk us through and tell us how you got through it?
Yes, of course. And I've always found that word failure to be very interesting because I think there have been many times in which things have certainly not gone according to plan. And I think those are ultimately really strong learning experiences that help us become better scientists. So, for example, I spent a lot of my early years in graduate school sort of hung up on a few questions or projects or systems that I had already worked on. And I think the motivation for this was not laziness or anything else. It was sort of a fear of stepping outside of the things I'd already done because I was probably afraid to fail. I was afraid to take on something really new and challenging because it might not work out. And then what? So I was essentially struggling against myself because the whole purpose of graduate school, the whole purpose of being a scientist in general is to grow. It's like Don Quixote said, it's to walk a lot and read a lot, to see a lot and know a lot. And in order to do that, you have to get out there, you have to climb, you have to fall, you have to struggle, you have to pick yourself up again. And it's really the process that builds us as scientists. And man, I can be stubborn. It took me a couple of years to really get over this. And I had really great mentorship and support. And even then, it was just something I needed to go through. And once I did, and once I realized that things not working out according to plan wasn't the end of the world, it just was really liberating. Because since then, a lot of things have not gone according to plan.
Right.
A paper doesn't get into the journal you hope it does, or a grant gets rejected, or a field season gets cut short because of something outside of your control. And I've learned to accept that better and accept it with stride. And I think it's made me more at peace as a scientist. It's made me more accepting of the process and therefore happier. And I honestly do my best science when I feel better, when I'm happier.
Certainly. So do you remember, Martha, what was maybe one of those first things that didn't go according to plan that started to make you more comfortable with this?
I often say that there's a cemetery of failed thesis ideas out there for me. Lots of epitaphs. So I had this idea that I was going to study female choice in anolis lizards and its role for speciation. And this has been a topic that's been very contentious in the literature because the evidence, at least at the behavioral level, is very contentious and equivocal. You know, there seem to be studies that support it, studies that don't. And overall, it seemed to be probably a high risk project that might not pay off. But I had all of this experience in neuroscience from my undergraduate career, and I had a lizard system that I had worked with before and I was familiar with that I thought would make a good test case for it. So I was going to do this neurological study looking for changes in activity in regions associated with mate choice in the lizard brain. And I went and learned a whole bunch of new methods and tried things out, and it just wasn't working. And I was so hesitant to let go because I had felt at this point that I had invested so much and I was going to lose all this time and that I had failed and I was going to let Jonathan down. I remember this one weekly meeting with Jonathan, and he's such a patient soul. He's so kind. And he had sort of watched the ups and downs of this idea, and he just let me talk. And at the end, he's like, Martha, it's time for you to let go. I remember being very silent and saying, okay.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing this story and kind of giving us a candid look at what that experience was like for you, because I think this is something that a lot of students experience, but maybe don't talk about. So you sort of feel like you're alone when you're going through this struggle and you're battling uphill for years, sometimes at a time. But we don't want to just focus on the difficult moments in your life and your career. Martha, I'd love to talk about the successes. So do you have a favorite success, whether it was a big win or a small victory, that you want to share with us today?
I think every day, honestly, in which I get to do some science and a little bit of what I love is a success. I honestly wake up every day really grateful for the way in which I get to spend my life. It's so different from the life that my parents had and their parents. They fled war, poverty, hunger, and they came here to give me and my sister a better life. And we had the privilege of simply going to school. So every day is a success for me. And I wake up very grateful for all of the privileges and wonderful things I have in my life. But in terms of specifics, I would say that going back to challenges, one of the challenges I experienced was learning to be a mentor, a PI. This isn't something we're necessarily trained to do when we're in graduate school and postdocs, and then suddenly we're thrust into a position in which we need to become also a manager and work with people. And people are very, very different. I haven't even had that many students in my lab or postdocs, but they're all so different from each other, and they all need really different mentorship strategies. So I would say that my feeling of success in the past few years has really come from seeing that I'm learning how to be a mentor and watching that manifest in my students growing in confidence and in intellectual independence, and finding ways to give them the confidence and empowering them to be independent scholars. And I can actually see that coming to fruition. I can see them mentally poring over ideas and feeling the confidence to share ideas and hypotheses. I can see them getting better at presenting their work and engaging with other scientists. I can see them intellectually carving apart a paper in a way that they couldn't even a year ago. All of those successes of my students feel rewarding for me. That's where I get a lot of my satisfaction these days. In addition to my work, that's really a source of happiness for me.
Definitely. I think when you've experienced that mentorship yourself, it's sort of gratifying to be able to pay it forward and help the next generation.
It's really, really important. I have an entire lifetime debt of gratitude to pay forward. And I guess another success I would say is just I get to live my dream job. I'm in an institution that really supports research. Yale has this amazing Peabody Museum that also has this infinite resource of inspiration from these collections. I have a wonderful group of colleagues, and I get to do all of this only 70 miles in a Metro North ride away from my family. Honestly, I'm so happy and grateful.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that you found a wonderful environment for yourself to work in as a scientist. And I think you've had experiences working all over the world throughout your career. And this opportunity to travel, to see different places, to go different places and meet people from all over the world is, I think, one of the unique perks of life as a scientist. So we love talking about this on our show as well. So Martha, when you think back over your career, is there a particular place that your science has taken you that was just the most memorable?
All of them, but I would have to say in terms of impact on one's life, I have to go back to my first field expedition ever in 2005, which was among all places in the world. I got to go to Indonesia to do an expedition on a live-aboard vessel where we were exploring the coral reefs and sampling different organisms for a genetic study. So imagine this kid from Queens. I went to Boston for my undergrad, also a big city, and I finally did it. I finally got out into the field. This was it. This was my first toes in the water, literally and figuratively, a lifetime of building up to this moment. And I got to do it on the coral reefs of Indonesia. And there's so many moments from that trip that were memorable. I remember my first moment just jumping in the water off the reef of Bunaken and seeing two humphead wrasses right there, just these big fish, maybe 10 feet away, and feeling like, oh my gosh, I might as well have been on Mars. It felt so different from everything I had experienced up until then. A few days later, so we spent a couple of weeks there and we were living on this boat. So we really got to adjust to life, this new reality of field work. And I remember this one morning I was snorkeling in the shallows off of Halmahera. And I remember that there were no houses that I could see. The particular shoreline that I was swimming nearby didn't have any habitation. I couldn't see any people. And it was so quiet except for the sound of the water and maybe for some birds. And then all of a sudden, the call to prayer was blaring. And it was so melodic and so beautiful. And I had this out-of-body experience where I could not have foreseen how different this experience was to everything that I had known up until that point. So it was one of those moments where my world suddenly grew. My understanding and my experience just grew. And it really, really stuck with me. And there's one other experience from that trip that I want to highlight. We ended up going on a night dive one of the nights just for fun, just to see what we could see. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of fresh off my scuba license at this point and a little bit hesitant of plummeting into the water in the darkness. And the person I was with was a dive master. So he had lots and lots and lots of experience. And he said, trust me, when we get down, I'm going to make a movement over the flashlight, which means it's time for you to turn off your flashlight. Just trust me. And I was very brave on the boat and said,
no problem.
Yeah, sure. No problem. I'll turn off my light 30 feet underwater in the dead of night. Not an issue. And then we were there. And I couldn't see the floor below me. I couldn't see the surface above me except when I had the light. And suddenly the dive master makes the movement over the flashlight, which means cut the light. And he just sees my face vigorously turning left or right. Heck no. Finally, my curiosity overcame my fear and I cut the light. And at first, nothing happened. I was neutrally buoyant and I was just sort of suspended in animation in the darkness of the sea at night. And then I think I just moved my arm a little bit and suddenly the bioluminescent larvae that were near my arm lit up next to it. And then I suddenly realized something magical was happening. And I took my fingers and I started moving them and I moved my legs. I started to do underwater ballet, these flips and turns and spins and cartwheels, because as I was doing so, the sea was lighting up around me in bright blue and pink and orange. And I was dancing with the ocean and I could never touch any of those lights. It was always just beyond my reach, which I think made it more magical still. And I have to tell you, he had to convince me to turn my light back on.
Wow, that is amazing. It sounds like this was just a life-changing experience for you. Was it hard then to transition back from this almost dream-like experience out there in the field to life in the city?
Yes. I was totally hooked. I knew that I was going to do that. I was going to go out into nature. And it turns out I didn't continue really in the long term with marine biology, but I discovered rainforests and island environments and lots of other beautiful green places.
Well, it sounds like you had a phenomenal experience there in Indonesia, and you were able to work with some amazing people over the years that we've mentioned in our conversation thus far. And I think as a scientist, there are stereotypes that a lot of people have of what scientists are like and what life as a scientist is like. And we try to break those on our show by really trying to highlight these other sides of life as a scientist, these humorous moments, quirky lab traditions, and just funny experiences you share with colleagues, because so many scientists are these amazing, dynamic, funny, creative people. So do you have a story of your own, Martha, that really highlights this human side of science that people don't often get to see?
I think about this sometime. We do have some quirky lab traditions, some Halloween activities that I've participated in. I've dressed up as my study organisms. That was fun.
Ooh.
But I think I would say that I definitely love doing the science, but I love doing the things that surround the science as well. So, for example, my most beloved tradition is to mix in as much joy and fun as you can around the science. So, for example, when I go to conferences or when I take my lab to conferences, I look forward to the science, all the talks and engagement, but I look forward to it just as much as getting together with the people involved in the science and going out afterwards and doing things together. When I go into the field, I, of course, work really, really hard, but I also do things that don't involve work. I go out and enjoy a good meal. I go and meet people. I honestly meet people. I go to bars, I go to restaurants, I make friends wherever I go, and then I do things with those friends. I love to go out dancing. I did my dissertation research in the Dominican Republic, so I spent a lot of time exploring the outdoors there and making friends, dancing, and having a wonderful time. So my fondest memories as a scientist, of course, include the work itself, but also all the memories that are forged around the science. And this is something I absolutely insist upon when my students and people in my lab go out into the field, especially if they're going for an extended period of time. Don't expect those moments to happen. Manufacture them. Build in quality time in the place where you are that has nothing to do with the science itself. Go make friends. Go explore. Go build in time off to do all the amazing other things that we like to do.
Definitely. And I think it is so important to give yourself that time, give yourself that space instead of getting tunnel vision and just focusing on your work the whole time, because I think you can get more creative ideas. You can make those connections with other people, which is so important.
I totally agree.
Well, that is amazing. And I'm glad to hear you're able to have some fun with your lab, because you are answering some amazing questions and working quite hard when you're in the lab. So I'd love to challenge you a little bit, Martha. If we gave you anything you could dream of, like funding, staff, technology, feasibility, the things that normally limit your research today, what would be the one question you would want to answer most with these unlimited resources?
Well, as an evolutionary biologist, I would love to know if life exists beyond Earth. What does it look like and how did it evolve?
Interesting. So if we gave you everything today, where would you start?
I would probably visit planets that have water. Those are good candidates for life evolving, and I'd search for life there. And if not, send probes out into the universe and search for life and see what it looks like and see if the same rules of assembly, the same building blocks that make life possible here on Earth are repeatable or not. Back in the 1980s, Stephen Jay Gould proposed this incredible thought experiment. If one were to go back in time and replay the tape of life, would we see the same outcomes today through that replay than the ones that actually occurred? And he was referring in large part to actually the Cambrian explosion. If we went back to that moment in time and replayed the tape of life and inserted some minor jot or jiggled the system a little bit, would the trajectory of life be radically different or fundamentally the same? And this thought experiment has inspired basically an entire generation of science, including a lot of what I do. But these thought experiments were, of course, restricted to the life that we know, which is on Earth. But why not conduct the ultimate experiment? Why not ask, if we replay the tape of life elsewhere in the universe, does it play out in the same way? How different are the building blocks? How many different ways can we make self-replicating life forms?
Well, I am intrigued, and you have given me and our listeners something to think about today. So thank you for that, Martha. And you've shared so much with us during our conversation. I would love to end with some advice. So Martha, when you think back about all the advice that you've received over your life, over your career, is there one particular piece that really helped you that you can pay forward to all of us today?
I'm going to share advice that I received from 5 women.
I like it.
So one of those women is one of my postdoctoral advisors, Dr. Sheila Paddock. who is currently at Duke University. And oftentimes when you don't look like the typical person in science, or the community was built around people who are probably very different than you, it's easy to feel alienated or to feel like you need to adjust how you interact with the world in order to be successful in science. And Sheila sees this. Sheila's been a scientist far longer than I have. She entered a community that was very male dominated at a time when things hadn't really moved towards equity in the way that they are starting to now. And she spoke to me very personally about her experiences. And if I could distill her advice, and this is not just from what she said to me, but just by observing her and how she interacts with the world and with her colleagues and with science in general, I would say that what I've learned from Sheila is that you don't need to change yourself to fit into science, that by being here, we make science fit around us, and that we make science broader simply by being here and by doing what we do. But beyond science, and Sheila has been a really positive and wonderful influence in my life, but the best advice I've received probably could relate to science, but it expands beyond that. And it's not advice per se, but I've been heavily influenced by 4 really important women in my life: my mother, my grandmother, my grandaunt, Margarita, and my aunt, Mari Carmen, who we call Tata. So I'm going to share what I think is the most important lessons I learned from each of them. From my grandmother, Mamita, I learned what it is to feel loved and how to love unconditionally. And I think this is probably the most important lesson I could have ever learned. From my mother, I learned the value of hard work and determination. From my grandaunt, Margarita, I learned how to face adversity with grace and to find hope and happiness in really difficult times, because that is how she lived her life. And from my aunt Tata, from Mari Carmen, she taught me how to fathom the impossible and to believe that I could achieve the boldest of my dreams. So it's not advice, but it's what I've learned from them and what I use every day. I channel them always.
Well, Martha, these are wonderful messages to share with our listeners and to pass on at the end of our conversation today. Is there any other last message you want to leave everybody with?
Surround yourself with people who lift you up and who bring out your best. And to those people who do that for you, always try to give them your best as well.
Fantastic message. A wonderful note for us to end our conversation on today. Martha, if our listeners want to learn more, what is the best way for them to do so?
I would definitely recommend that they check out my website if they're interested in my science. It's www.marthamuñoz.com. Muñoz is spelled M-U-N-O-Z. I'm also available by email at martha.muñoz@yale.edu. And I'm on Twitter, where I tweet mostly about science and sometimes about my dog. My Twitter handle is MARMMUNOZ, Marm Muñoz.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Martha on Twitter. Check out her website. Get in touch if you have questions. And Martha, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you on the show today.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. This has been so wonderful.
Well, we appreciate you spending time with us today. And listeners, it's been great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.